Hi, my name is Peter Rain, and this is my home studio. I'm going to show you best I can how I built it, why I built it, and what makes it different from your typical voiceover booth. This is the first of a 4-part video series where I'm going to go over every step of the way how this came together. In the 4th video, I'll be kind of going over some more questions and specifics, so if there's anything that you wonder as we go along, just let me know in the comments. In this video, I'm going to go over why I strayed from the typical voiceover booth, a bit of information I needed to learn going into it, and the planning process. The first step in building this studio was deciding to build a studio at all, instead of a booth as more typical for voice actors. So, a little background. I recently moved from an apartment into a house with my partner. My old studio was something that probably looks very familiar to most voice actors. A walk-in closet lined with some acoustic foam wedges. And clothes. It was okay. A little cramped, and I always have to have the low cut on my mic on, and the AC had to be off. The apartment was decently quiet, and other than occasionally overheating, it got the job done. Moving into the house, I was faced with a problem and an opportunity. Problem: no walk-in closets to speak of that would work for what I needed. Opportunity: a small, unused bedroom that could function as my office. My original plan is likely what most voice actors would think of: build a sound booth inside of the room. I could sort of tuck the booth into the closet and have space outside the booth for my desk and office chair. I could maybe even get some vents going. And with good planning and a little luck, it would probably sound maybe 10 to 15% better than my previous setup. So what changed? Well, I'm also a musician, and recently recorded an EP with my duo, Occam's Rose, late last year at an amazing studio in Fort Collins called The Blasting Room. EP available everywhere you stream music. The Blasting Room, which has some amazingly influential records to its name, has fantastic acoustic design and treatment. I decided to reach out to the acoustician who actually designed it, and he was kind enough to meet me for a consultation that basically rocked my world. John Brandt is a professional acoustician and engineer who has designed hundreds of studios around the world for almost 50 years. He's also got a free resource page on his website and super informative videos on YouTube that I definitely recommend checking out. I'll put some links down below. When I talked to him, told him about my current situation and plans, he essentially said, "Why? Why wouldn't you treat the whole room?" And I basically answered, "Because voice actors live in our little booths. That's what we do." And he showed me that for my situation, where I had my own room to do anything I wanted with, and I live in a relatively quiet neighborhood in the suburbs, not in the heart of Denver, it would be easier, much more effective, feel better, and wouldn't cost too much more to treat the whole room. Okay, it did end up costing a fair bit more, but it was worth it in my opinion, but more on that later. We talked after the studio was finished. Here's a little of that conversation about the science of why it's better to have a larger space than a smaller one, if you can. So the main question is that some people I've talked to have asked is why the whole room and why not a booth? What I've got going on is not that crazy for a working studio musician, but it's not that common for a working voice actor.
Our voices, male voices, resonate all the way down to 80 hertz easy. 9 feet is 125 hertz. It's 10 feet, that's 112 hertz.
And to be clear, this is how much space is needed for that frequency to dissipate.
Yeah. 12 feet is 93 hertz. So see, you need that space just for male voice, okay? Female voice can go as low as 90 hertz, for sure. So you need the space. It gives it a naturalness, Also, in a small-ish room, which is what this is, it's still small room acoustics. You have room boundary effects. If all your boundaries are too close, there is no place for distribution to exist. So distribution is non-existent in these tiny booths. Okay, you don't have any kind of mode distribution. You have a resonance here, and if you're centered, you're right in the middle of that resonance. And if you're centered this way, you're in the middle of that resonance. And if you're centered heightways, you're in the middle of the. It's the worst place to be. So you
Hmm.
never want to be in the middle of any room dimensions, really. That creates their own some some of their own problems. Having these very small spaces, you're limited in what you can do.
And those acoustic wedges don't, especially the low end, they don't
They do
absorb that.
nothing. They do nothing for low frequency. They do fine all the way down to maybe 500 hertz. You know.
Hmm. And that makes sense because when I was in my little booth on my microphone, I had the low cut on because I needed it, and
Mm,
it worked. But now I don't need that anymore. So,
absolutely.
question.
Usually these small booths, the companies that make them, they're fine. It's a good product, but they do. If you really want to optimize them, they need more treatment. There's little tones and resonances in them that it's a little bit fussy, and you have to work with it. Um, Soundproofing, some of them is questionable, but usually if you put it in an existing room, it's enough. It soundproofs you enough from the outside world, so that it couples with your room structure and gives you like a room in a room effect. So you're fairly well isolated, even though their unique isolation, just them by themselves, isn't that much. It just adds to what your existing room is.
Yeah.
But once you get the space quiet, you can treat it like this, and it's just like, oh, this is I can do anything I want in here. You don't have to add EQ and do jump through these hoops to get the sound you want. If you want a real natural sound, you can get it. If you want a real compressed, real close-up sound, you can get it. If you want a faraway sound, you can get it. You know what I mean? And there are different techniques. Especially if you're doing ADR for movies. A lot of time, all the voice isn't close up. It's a little further away. It's like, and you need a room for that. But it needs to be pretty dead. But still, it's not you don't have to get that proximity. So you can do it.
Right, absolutely. So I decided it would be in my best interest, long term, to make an investment in my space, hire John to design the studio and provide ongoing support, and get to work. Rather than a hot booth and cramped office desk, I would instead have one open studio office that would provide ample ventilation, better sound quality, and function as a great space to not only record voiceover, but live instruments as well. So, let's get into the planning phase. First, let's talk about sound isolation and acoustic treatment and the difference between them. Simply put, sound isolation prevents outside noise from entering your space, and acoustic treatment is making the space itself sound great for the type of recording or listening you intend to do in it. While they sound similar and may even use some of the same tools, they can actually look quite different. For example, you could have a closet filled with the most high-quality acoustic foam money can buy, big bass traps in the corners, and yet your mic still picks up paper shuffling in the room next door, or the hum of the fridge, because you aren't getting enough isolation. Conversely, you could be in a room by itself at the bottom of the link, dead silent, and still get strange reflection sounds and bad recordings if the room isn't acoustically treated well. For isolation, there are essentially 3, maybe 4 things to consider. And again, this is in layman's terms and just the basics. I am not a qualified acoustician, which is why I hired John. I'm just spreading the knowledge I gained from this process. Those things are mass, air, and distance. The 4th is material, but that goes along with mass. Mass is pretty straightforward. How much stuff is between you and the source of sound? The more the better. Air is the primary medium sound travels through, so you want to make sure all entering and leaving your space is controlled and isolated, and there is no air coming in or out that you don't control. Distance is also straightforward. The further away you are from the source of sound, the quieter it is. This also plays into the room within a room structures with an air gap. I won't get into that too much since it isn't what I did, but there might be some useful pointers. Treatment is a little more complicated, but it generally boils down to acoustic absorption and diffusion, and how they affect the sound reflections across the frequency spectrum. The frequency spectrum is all about wavelength, which we hear as pitch. But even if you were to sing one note, it would actually create many frequencies called harmonics all across the spectrum. And all those extra frequencies are also what create the difference in sound, like why a French horn sounds different from a clarinet, and what makes all our voices unique. Because sound travels in waves, and different wavelengths create those different frequencies, they actually travel at different speeds, and that's where we get into the reflections. See, sound reflects off most surfaces, especially hard ones, which is why you would be so echoey if you were to shout in your bathroom. But what's interesting is that because of those different wavelengths, different frequencies will respond differently with different surfaces and bounce and react differently as they move around. And that's also why one material might work differently for different frequencies. All that being said, most of what we need for voiceover is absorption. In other words, preventing the reflections of all the frequencies from coming back into the microphone. You may have heard of what's called an NRC rating, which is essentially how acoustically absorbent a material is. It was originally on a scale from 0 to 1, until they found better material, and so now it goes above 1. So basically, the higher the better. This is useful in general, however, it doesn't actually tell the full picture, because most of the time, absorption isn't consistent across the frequency spectrum, leaving much to be desired on the far ends, especially the bass. For example, there are some acoustic foam wedges that have NRC ratings up to 1.1. Pretty high, but they still don't actually absorb anything from the low end of the frequency spectrum. To get the specifics, you may need to talk to an acoustician who's actually tested various materials across the frequency spectrum, but in general, almost any kind of insulation panel is going to have better absorption than foam, especially for lower frequencies. Spoiler alert, some of my absorption panels are filled with basic Owens Corning pink, and they have better bass absorption than almost all of the bass traps on the market. So we know we need absorption, but what can really make a studio stand out is utilizing diffusion. Diffusion breaks up the different frequencies and spreads them out. If you have a space entirely made out of absorption panels or just utilizing absorption without any diffusion, yes, your voice will be isolated, but it will also make you sound unnatural because we don't actually talk or exist in any space like that. We don't live in a vacuum. Now, because we were all forced to record in our own little booths during the pandemic, many studios are now comfortable with fixing that totally dead sound in post-production, but that may not be what you want across your general auditions and productions. So with diffusers, I can't exactly explain the science behind it, but I can explain the sound. Diffusers essentially spread the frequencies to make a space sound and feel more natural, and actually make a space sound larger. It doesn't always have to be something kind of crazy like I'm doing. Sometimes just having an angled wall or ceiling is enough to bring life into your booth, because it changes the direction of those frequencies. Diffusion is especially important in mixing and listening rooms, and often equals the absorption treatment, because you want to listen with the most realistic setting possible while still being treated. For recording, however, just a touch of diffusion can bring more life into your voiceovers. Now, to my build. Here is the room I started with. John provided me with instructions for both isolation and treatment, as well as some blueprints to work with. The most challenging aspect of the planning for me was figuring out all the wood I needed and planning out the most efficient way to cut it all so I would get the most for my money and create the best cuts. Also, since it was a custom build designed to fit my space, a lot of the panels would have slightly different dimensions, which meant it would work well in the end, but it also meant a lot more math and planning needed to go into it. On top of that, I had to account for the fact that wood in America is sold at incorrect measurements. For example, the 2-inch by 1-inch boards are actually 1 3/4 by 3/4, which is frustrating and seems unnecessary to me, but what do I know? I'm not a carpenter. But really, could we all agree to sell wood at the correct measurements? Is that crazy? Anyway, the fabric also took some planning, but wasn't nearly as meticulous, since having a little extra is never a bad thing. I went with burlap, which wholesale is very affordable, and came nicely in the colors I wanted, navy, gray, and white. But more importantly, burlap is one of the fabrics that is acoustically transparent, which means that sound will travel through the fabric and not reflect off of it. And that's really important because you want the sound to go through your fabric into your treatment, not bounce off of the fabric. One of the more difficult aspects of planning was actually just acquiring some of the materials. 2 of them specifically. The first was rigid plenum duct liner board for the baffle boxes. Feels like it should be easy to find, but pretty much all the duct insulation at Lowe's and Home Depot was designed to go around the ducts, not in it, and so wasn't designed to be breathable. You need it to be breathable because you're going to be breathing it. I ended up getting it from a local roofing distribution warehouse. The other material that was surprisingly hard for me to find was the high-density rigid fiberglass insulation I needed for some of my panels. I ended up having to get it shipped from New Jersey, which was not cheap because no one carries it. Apparently it's pretty accessible in other countries, but not here. I mentioned that only as a disclaimer that if you're looking to do a project like this, you may have to do some digging to get the materials you need. The laminated glass also took a few phone calls, and although I don't have it yet, as you'll see, I do have a local source to get it when I'm ready. The last part of the planning that was vital was figuring out what the lighting would look like. Obviously, the ceiling fan can't stay because the panels will be there. Unfortunately, this is the best pick I could find of it, but there were 3 switches in this room. One for light, one for the fan, and one for some reason a fader connected to an outlet across the room. We couldn't figure out why on earth the previous owners decided to connect a fader switch to a socket, but obviously that would have to go. For the lights, I could maybe clamber through the attic to set up floodlights to put in the panels, which many of John's studios have done and look fantastic, but I didn't want to do that or hire an electrician for that. I also didn't want to deal with putting lights in the panels and adding all those extra steps in the construction process. We decided instead on simple, inexpensive strip lighting that could run from a single box near the door. And that's it for this one. If you found it interesting or helpful in any way, please share it around. Let me know in the comments your thoughts and ideas. And in the next video, we're going to dive into the isolation process, what I did, and what might be of use to you. Thanks again for watching. Take care.